Imagine living in a quiet suburb of London. You've got a normal tech job. You take the tube on the weekends. You pay your taxes.
Right, it's just living your life.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Then one morning you wake up, you check the news, and you discover that a government 6,000 miles away has just placed a $1 million bounty on your head,
Oh,
which is roughly 127,000 US dollars.
wow.
And it's offered to anyone who can help secure your arrest, simply because you published like a pro-democracy op-ed or organized a peaceful rally back in your home city years ago.
Yeah, I mean, welcome to the staggering reality of the International Lifeboat campaign.
Exactly.
It really shatters that illusion that crossing border guarantees safety.
Yeah.
We are kind of watching the complete erosion of traditional geographical jurisdictions.
So, okay, let's unpack this, because today's stack of sources outlines one of the most complex geopolitical shifts of the 21st century. And it's playing out right now. We're looking at how Western nations are fundamentally rewriting their immigration codes to extract hundreds of thousands of people from Hong Kong.
Right, in response to sweeping new security laws imposed by Beijing.
Yeah. So our mission today for this deep dive is to map the architecture of this crisis.
Right.
We need to understand the legal mechanics of these so-called lifeboats.
Right.
And analyze how different countries, from the UK to the US to the EU, are deploying them.
And critically, we need to examine the data to see who is actually being left behind.
Yeah, the left behind part is huge.
It really is. And the documentation we have to work with today is incredibly robust. We're synthesizing research briefings from the Council on Geostrategy, campaign reports from the NGO Hong Kong Watch, and some deeply revealing demographic data from La Trobe University's migration studies.
And to make sure we aren't just, looking at this strictly through a Western academic lens, we're also integrating ground-level news reporting from the South China Morning Post and Radio Free Asia.
Right, giving us the full picture.
Exactly. And just a quick note before we dive in. Because this involves highly charged political actions between Western nations and China, we are simply reporting what these specific sources state. We're not taking sides or endorsing any government's viewpoint.
Right, we just want to lay out the mechanics of what is actually happening.
Yeah, so you can understand the gears of this conflict.
Yeah.
Because looking at the geopolitical chessboard in these sources, Beijing argues these laws are just necessary internal security measures, to restore order and safeguard economic development.
While Western lawmakers argue they are a violation of international treaties and fundamental human rights.
Right. So to understand the sheer scale of this coordinated global immigration response, we first have to understand the catalyst.
Yeah, the sources document a massive hollowing out of Hong Kong's community infrastructure. I mean, since June 2020, we've seen over 290 arrests under the new security protocols.
Wow.
And the disbanding of at least 58 civil society groups. So unions, legal defense funds, independent media.
See, I want to dig into the legal mechanics of that catalyst because, laws change in every country.
Sure.
Governments update security protocols and anti-terrorism statutes all the time.
Yeah.
But looking at the Council on Geostrategy briefing, the shift here isn't just a policy update. It's a fundamental rewiring of the legal operating system.
Yeah, it's a total overhaul.
Because Hong Kong historically operated under a common law system, inheriting traditions from the UK Privy Council.
Right.
And under that old framework, if a prosecutor wanted to convict you of sedition, they had a massive burden of proof.
Yeah.
They essentially had to draw a direct, tangible line between your words and an imminent act of physical public disorder or violence.
And that requirement for an imminent threat of violence, that was the firewall protecting free speech.
Right.
What the 2020 National Security Law, the NSL, and the March 2024 Article 23 did.
Which is officially the Safeguarding National Security Bill, right?
Yes, exactly. What they did was completely dismantle that firewall. The new legal definition of seditious intention, it no longer requires prosecutors to prove that an act would incite disorder.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the law expands to criminalize just a vast, ambiguous spectrum of activities under the umbrellas of treason, secession, subversion, and theft of state secrets.
And it's the real-world application of this ambiguity that's driving the panic. I mean, it's not just abstract legal theory. The sources highlight this case, where 5 individuals were sentenced to 19 months in prison for publishing children's picture books that allegedly depicted pro-democracy protests.
Right.
19 months
For a cartoon book, essentially.
yeah, for a cartoon. Or consider the 27-year-old man denied bail simply for wearing a T-shirt and a surgical mask with slogans from the 2019 protests.
Which is why, but I would take that a step further and point out that the chilling effect, it isn't limited to political activists.
Really?
Yeah, the language in Article 23 regarding state secrets explicitly states that measures to safeguard national security will depend on the actual situation.
Depending on the actual situation.
Yeah. That phrase is a legal black hole. The Council on Geostrategy briefing highlights profound anxieties within Hong Kong's financial and accountancy sectors.
Well, which makes perfect sense when you think about what an auditor does. If the definition of a state secret can retroactively shift depending on the political mood of the actual situation,
Exactly.
how can an independent financial firm audit a state-linked enterprise?
They can't. Not safely.
Or how can a researcher publish a report on demographic economic shifts without fearing they've inadvertently crossed an invisible red line?
Right. The predictability of the law, which is the foundation of any global financial hub, it simply vanishes.
And this legal ambiguity was introduced simultaneously with a complete structural overhaul of the city's governance right.
Mm-hmm.
Beijing implemented a framework often referred to as Patriots Administering Hong Kong.
Right. The restructuring of the Legislative Council, this is a fascinating mechanism of control, actually. In 2021, they slashed the number of directly elected seats in Hong Kong's parliament from 35 down to 20.
Wow.
And they didn't just reduce the seats, they introduced a vetting committee to ensure every candidate demonstrated sufficient political allegiance before they could even run. And the response from the population was immediate, and it's super visible in the data. There was a total collapse in voter turnout.
Yeah.
It dropped to a record low of 33.2% for the Legislative Council and a staggering 27.59% for the local district councils.
Right, and when you combine that electoral boycott with the forced closure of independent media giants like Apple Daily and Stand News, and the jailing of 47 pro-democracy figures just for the simple act of organizing an unofficial primary election,
Right.
you create an environment of total systemic enclosure.
Right.
So if you're a professional, an activist, or even just a resident watching this systemic enclosure, and the legal tripwires are now completely invisible, your instinct is to leave.
Naturally.
But moving hundreds of thousands of people across international borders requires a mechanism. You can't just buy a plane ticket and declare yourself a resident of London.
No, you definitely can't.
And this is where the International Lifeboat campaign comes in.
Exactly. The campaign was formally initiated by advocacy networks, prominently featuring the NGO Hong Kong Watch, alongside international parliamentarians like Lord David Alton and Benedict Rogers.
And their strategy wasn't to simply ask for standard refugee quotas, right?
No, they lobbied Western governments to radically reform their existing work, study, and asylum visas to create bespoke pathways to citizenship.
The strategy outlined in the Hong Kong Watch reports frames this as an insurance policy.
Right.
The logic being that if pro-democracy advocates, journalists, and civil society leaders have a guaranteed fast-track pathway out of the city, they can continue their advocacy with a safety net.
It mitigates that paralyzing fear of being trapped in a closed system.
But I guess my question is, once they are on the lifeboat and out of Hong Kong, are they completely safe?
Well, that's the catch. The efficacy of that insurance policy is severely tested by the extraterritorial provisions built into these new security laws. Article 23 explicitly asserts jurisdiction over anyone holding a valid Hong Kong identity card, an HKID, regardless of where they are physically located on the planet.
Which brings us back to the bounty scenario we opened with. Jurisdiction no longer stops at the border.
Exactly. We are talking about the weaponization of domestic law to facilitate transnational repression.
Because the sources document authorities canceling the passports of exiled individuals and issuing those $1 million bounties for activists currently residing in the UK, the US, and Australia.
And it creates an unprecedented diplomatic nightmare for the host countries. I mean, think about it. When a nation issues a visa, they are implicitly promising the protection of their sovereign laws.
Right.
But if a foreign intelligence apparatus is actively monitoring, harassing, or placing bounties on those visa holders within your borders, the host country has to pivot.
They have to go from processing immigration paperwork to actively deploying counterespionage and domestic security resources to protect them.
Exactly. It forces Western police departments to deal with foreign policy crises in their own jurisdictions.
So with that threat matrix in mind, let's analyze the actual visa mechanisms of lifeboats themselves. Because looking at the data, the responses from different nations are wildly divergent in their scale and their legal mechanics.
Yeah, they really are.
So let's start with the largest structural change, which is the UK's B&O visa scheme.
The scale of the UK's response is historically unprecedented. It centers on the British national overseas status.
And I think we need to clarify what that status actually is because it explains the magnitude of the shift. Prior to this crisis, a B&O passport, which was a legacy of the 1997 handover of Hong Kong from Britain to China, it was essentially just a travel document. It gave you consular assistance and allowed you to visit the UK for up to 6 months without a visa. But it emphatically did not grant you the right to live, work, or settle in the UK permanently.
It was a status without a home.
Exactly.
And that's the critical context.
Yeah.
The UK government essentially took a restrictive legacy travel document and retrofitted it into a massive pathway to full British citizenship.
Yeah.
Under the new scheme, BNO status holders and their dependents can move to the UK to live, work, and study for 5 years. After that, they can apply for settlement, and a year later, citizenship.
And out of Hong Kong's population of roughly 7.5 million, the UK estimates a staggering 5.4 million people are theoretically eligible.
It is a demographic vacuum cleaner.
It really is. And the data shows it's highly utilized. Over 160,000 Hong Kongers have already resettled in the UK under this specific pathway.
Yeah.
Now, contrast that sweeping demographic approach with how Canada and Australia are handling it.
Right.
If the UK brought a cruise ship, Canada and Australia brought targeted speedboats for specific types of passengers. Their policies read much less like a blanket rescue mission and much more like highly targeted economic brain gain strategies.
That is a very accurate reading of the Canadian and Australian mechanics. They recognized that the UK was absorbing the sheer volume, which allowed them to tailor their domestic immigration policies to capture specific demographics.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so Canada, for instance, engineered 3 distinct streams, but the most impactful is their young talents pathway.
Right. The Canadian model offers open work permits, but specifically to individuals who have graduated from a post-secondary institution within the last 10 years.
And an open work permit is crucial here. It means you don't need a corporate sponsor tying you to a specific job before you arrive.
You can just land in Vancouver or Toronto and immediately enter the labor market, eventually transitioning to permanent residency.
Exactly. And the Hong Kong Watch briefing estimates this could cover up to 200,000 highly educated young professionals.
Now Australia took an even more pragmatic approach. Rather than trying to attract new arrivals, they focused on securing the human capital already within their borders.
Right.
They constructed pathways to permanent residency specifically for the roughly 11,000 Hong Kongers who were already onshore holding temporary student or skilled temporary worker visas.
The message was clear. If you are already contributing to our economy and universities, we will permanently shield you from returning to the NSL jurisdiction.
So if the UK, Canada, and Australia are offering permanent structural pathways to citizenship, what happens when you look at the United States? Because the U.S. approach, detailed in the sources, bypasses the legislative process entirely.
Yeah, it relies on an executive tool called Deferred Enforced Departure, or DED.
And the use of DED highlights the paralysis of the U.S. domestic immigration system, right? Passing a bespoke permanent visa program for Hong Kongers through a deeply divided U.S. Congress is politically near impossible right now.
Exactly. So President Biden utilized DED, which is an executive action that shields a specific class of people, in this case, Hong Kong residents currently in the U.S., from deportation.
But it's inherently temporary. It was recently extended for another 24 months, and it allows those covered to apply for employment authorization, but it doesn't create a straight line to a green card or a U.S. passport.
Right. It's essentially a 24-month holding pattern for somewhere between 3,800 and 20,000 people.
Yet, despite being a temporary, relatively small-scale measure, it triggered an explosive geopolitical reaction.
It really did.
The rhetoric documented in the South China Morning Post is intense. When the U.S. announced the extension of this DED status, the Chinese Foreign Ministry and the Hong Kong government released blistering statements categorizing the move as hegemonic bullying.
Wow.
Beijing accused Washington of fabricating concerns over the rule of law to deliberately stir up chaos, claiming the U.S. was harboring anti-China forces and exploiting Hong Kong as a strategic pawn to contain China's broader economic and political development.
And, I mean, again, just remaining neutral here, but it perfectly illustrates the core friction of this entire deep dive. Domestic immigration policy is indistinguishable from foreign policy.
Yes.
The U.S. deciding not to deport a few thousand students and professionals is interpreted by Beijing as a direct attack on its national sovereignty.
And nowhere is the friction of foreign policy more visible than in the European Union, which brings us to a fascinating case study in institutional gridlock.
Yeah. The EU situation is so complex.
The sources detail how the European Parliament has been highly vocal, passing urgency resolutions condemning Article 23, demanding the release of political prisoners, and strongly urging member states to launch their own lifeboat schemes and suspend extradition treaties with China. But it hasn't resulted in a unified EU lifeboat.
Well, the European Parliament has the power to urge, but it lacks the executive authority to mandate the domestic immigration frameworks of its sovereign member states.
Right.
EU foreign policy actions of this magnitude generally require unanimity. And the research points out that individual member states, particularly Hungary, have strategically exercised their veto power to block collective EU-wide packages of measures designed to support Hong Kong.
So a unified EU fleet is effectively grounded by the veto system.
Exactly.
But we do see individual nations bypassing the bloc. Germany created a significant legal precedent by granting political asylum to Ray Wang, explicitly citing the political climate in Hong Kong.
And Sweden followed, granting asylum to journalist Narayan Liu, specifically naming the national security law as the catalyst for the approval.
But we have to distinguish between individual asylum grants and a structural lifeboat policy.
Absolutely.
A bespoke visa, like the UK's BNO, allows you to plan your exit. Traditional political asylum requires you to physically escape the jurisdiction, arrive in the host country, and then navigate a notoriously complex, highly bureaucratic, and deeply time-consuming legal process.
Often while your passport is being canceled by your home government.
Which brings us to the most sobering statistic in this entire stack of sources.
Yeah, this is the tough part.
When you tally up the UK's massive BNO scheme, Canada's young talent permits, Australia's onshore pathways, and the U.S. holding pattern, it sounds like an unprecedented global rescue.
It does.
But the Hong Kong Watch briefing calculates that at least 1.9 million Hong Kongers have absolutely no viable route out of the city.
A quarter of the population is completely stranded.
Yeah. So what does this all mean? Who exactly is falling through the cracks?
Well, the mechanisms fail when they meet the granular reality of the demographics.
I want to break down exactly why they are stranded, because it exposes the flaws in the design of these policies. The most glaring issue is the generational gap built into the UK's BNO visa.
Right.
We noted earlier that BNO status is tied to the 1997 handover.
Yeah.
The cruel irony is that the young people who were disproportionately on the front lines of the 2019 pro-democracy protests were born after 1997.
Right. So if their parents did not proactively register them for BNO status when they were minors, they have no independent right to apply for the UK lifeboat.
It's a legal paradox.
Yeah.
The demographic facing the highest risk of arrest under the new definitions of sedition is structurally locked out of the largest international pathway.
Yeah. The UK has slowly attempted to patch this by allowing adult children of BNO holders to apply independently in certain circumstances, but the barrier remains extremely high.
It's like having a fire escape, but the door only unlocks if you can prove you were born before a specific year.
That's exactly it. And when you look at Canada's system, the barriers aren't generational, they are socioeconomic.
Right.
The young talent stream is phenomenal if you have a recent university degree and the liquid capital to relocate. But if you are a working-class resident or a student who was expelled or jailed before finishing your degree, you just don't meet the educational criteria.
Furthermore, Canada's policies have sunset clauses, meaning they are set to expire. If you graduate a month after the policy window closes, you're trapped.
And this is the critical blind spot of treating immigration policy as a human rights response. Immigration systems are inherently designed to select for capital, education, and specific skills.
Right.
They are not historically designed for mass, equitable extraction based on political vulnerability.
So we have nearly 2 million people who cannot leave. But I want to pivot to the data from the La Trobe University migration study because we need to examine what happens to the city itself when hundreds of thousands of its most highly educated citizens do manage to utilize these lifeboats. What happens to a global financial hub when its professionals leave?
Well, the La Trobe study provides a fascinating look into the anatomy of a brain drain. The demographics of the exodus are highly skewed. The individuals utilizing the UK, Canadian, and Australian pathways are overwhelmingly younger, highly educated professionals.
So like the managerial class, the tech sector, finance, healthcare.
Exactly, and they are taking their young families with them.
And the ripple effects detailed in the study are staggering. They documented a drop of over 20,000 primary school students by the end of 2022.
And 20,000 vanished students isn't just an abstract demographic shift. It triggers a cascading institutional failure.
Exactly. If you lose 20,000 students, schools are forced to consolidate or permanently close due to plummeting enrollment funding.
Right.
When schools close, you trigger mass layoffs and an escalation in teacher turnover. The professionals leaving aren't just taking their tax revenue, they're taking the fundamental skills required to run a global financial hub.
You lose the auditors who understand international compliance, the senior nurses in the wards, the professors in the universities.
And it forces a rapid demographic and economic restructuring of the city. The vacuum left by the departing middle class is actively being filled by new migration streams from mainland China, which fundamentally alters the sociocultural fabric and the economic operating model of Hong Kong.
So to synthesize the mechanics we've explored today, we are witnessing how the introduction of legally ambiguous security laws, specifically the NSL and Article 23, dismantled the predictability of a common law system, triggering an exodus.
Yeah. And in response, Western nations engineered the International Lifeboat campaign, repurposing colonial-era travel documents and economic visas into massive pathways for citizenship.
Yet, due to generational and socioeconomic blind spots in these very policies, millions remain stranded in a city undergoing a profound structural brain drain.
It is a phenomenal case study in the modern geopolitical reality. It proves that a domestic security law passed in one hemisphere can dictate the demographic and economic makeup of neighborhoods in London, Vancouver, and Sydney.
While simultaneously redefining the diplomatic relationship between the East and the West.
It really exposes the invisible connective tissue of global legal systems. Which actually brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with today, building on the mechanisms we've discussed. We've spent this entire deep dive analyzing the physical relocation of people, the literal lifeboats, the visas, the planes carrying human bodies across borders to safety. But as we look at the reality of transnational repression, the millions in bounties and laws that explicitly claim jurisdiction over a digital identity card anywhere on Earth, we have to ask a harder question. In a 21st century landscape where AI and digital surveillance render physical borders increasingly porous, and where the law can follow you across the ocean through your smartphone, is a physical lifeboat actually enough to escape a digital net? When your digital footprint is subject to a legal code 6,000 miles away, what does the concept of asylum even mean anymore?
Wow.
Something to mull over. Until next time.